want to talk about what in rhetoric is called accommodation. And accommodation is a concept, a term that a rhetorician named Jeannie Fahnestock came up with, coined the phrase in 1986. And it's essentially a term for the process involved when you rewrite or present scientific technical information to non-scientists, non-expert audiences. And since we're talking about science, I think I'll follow tradition and start with the scientist. This is what Albert Einstein says, right? Don't listen to me, let's listen to Albert. He says, anyone who has ever tried to present a rather abstract scientific subject in a popular manner knows the great difficulties of such an attempt. Either he succeeds in being intelligible by concealing the core of the problem and by offering the reader only superficial aspects of the vague illusions, thus deceiving the reader by arousing in him the deceptive illusion of comprehension. Or else he gives the expert account of the problem, but in such a fashion that the untrained reader is unable to follow the exposition and becomes discouraged from reading any further. If these two categories are omitted from today's popular scientific literature, surprisingly little remains. Slide. So as Einstein and Jeannie Fahnestock are suggesting to us, accommodating science is a really tricky project. If you leave out too much detail and complexity, you're essentially misleading or misinforming your reader. You're being, if not dishonest, at least deceptive. But if you include too much detail, too many precise technical distinctions, you're going to lose your reader or lose your reader's attention. The challenge for those of us doing this is that if you want to present scientific knowledge to non-specialist readers, which is the task of this first module, you have to do two things. You have to accurately represent the core, the essential argument of a scientific text and some sense of why it's significant, but you've also got to reframe it in a context, in a language, and in a form that's really compelling to readers. And I say compelling as opposed to comprehensible, because you don't want them just to understand it. You want them to be compelled to read on, to enjoy it, and then to think about and act on what you've said. That's the challenge. Slide. So as you're accommodating science or sustainability for non-expert audiences, you've got to balance the public's right to know with their ability to understand and their level of interest. And we'll get to this in the third module in the class when we talk about public participation. But there's a long debate in American political theory starting in the early 20th century about whether the public has a right to know things and we should engage in kind of democratic deliberations, or whether the public is incapable of understanding science and the scientists and the technical people should do it for them and they shouldn't be part of the conversation. We'll talk about that. That's a big debate in American political and scientific discourse for the last 100 years. But for those of us writing about sustainability and science, we're always doing more than just educating and conveying information. That's part of your job. But in sustainability, we're also trying to build community, shift people's values, compel them to actually act instead of just think about something. So in addition to providing information in ways that are accessible, you're trying to do other kinds of social work at the same time. And we're going to talk about that. Please. So writers generally accommodate scientific texts two ways: to non-expert audiences, popular audiences, and to policy audiences, people who make decisions, to legislators, regulators, decision makers. I've written lots of things for the USDA and their policy makers. Those are the groups. They have quite different concerns. They use the information they read differently. They have different purposes for reading. Obviously, they have different levels of understanding of the technical language and the methods of science. But both groups are really important to us for doing science and sustainability. As you begin planning how to accommodate in this first module a piece of science and technical information to these audiences, you might think of them as stakeholder groups. That tends to be how sustainability discourse talks about them. If you're a rhetorician, they're an audience. If you're in sustainability, it's a stakeholder group. You need to understand what they know, what they're reading, how they read, why they read, and importantly for me, what they're going to do, how they're going to use the material, what they're going to do with this, because they do different things with this information depending on which side you're on of our divide here. Next slide, please. So in this module, we're going to talk about an essay from Science of the Total Environment on e-waste, a technical essay on electronic waste or e-waste. And we're going to look at, as an example, a case study, if you will, a piece from the National Geographic called High-Tech Trash that's an accommodation for a non-expert audience. And we're going to look at a policy statement about e-waste from the American Society of Civil Engineers, which is an accommodation of the technical material to a group of policymakers. Obviously, the scientific language is going to change as it goes from the top to either one of these, but there are a lot more and more specific and useful kinds of changes as you accommodate a technical text to these two audiences. And we're going to spend some time looking at that. I will actually walk through some of this in about 10 minutes, and we will talk about it next class. Your assignment, part of your assignment for next class is to read these three pieces, and we're going to come in and talk about it and write on the board and map what changes from one to the other. So I've sort of covered what your homework for next time is going to be. Next slide, please. In this module, we'll talk about some concepts from rhetoric. Tonight we're going to talk about Aristotle's divisions of persuasive speech into forensic, deliberative, and epidictic speech. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight. In the next couple of weeks, we will talk about what rhetoric calls the rhetorical situation and a very simple but powerful concept known as genre, rhetorical genre theory. So I'm going to start with the divisions of rhetoric from Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was writing, you may or may not know, the philosopher Aristotle wrote a book on rhetoric, 4th century BC in Athens, and he divides persuasive speech into these three basic categories, forensic, deliberative, and epidictic. A number of historians in my little discipline have pointed out that life was actually sort of simpler in 4th century BC Athens, and it doesn't really map perfectly onto technical 21st century American discourse, and that you can't, reduce it the way I'm going to for pedagogical purposes, but that there are hybrid forms in our culture that do forensic and epidictic, that they're not pure firewalls of style between these three, but I'm going to treat them to some extent as if they were, because it's clarifying. If somebody says, well, wait a minute, this one, I say, yeah, this one's, 90% forensic, 10% deliberative. I've published articles with scientists where we were doing hardcore science, but at the end we were trying to push policymakers to see that the policy implications of the science we were doing, would suggest these kinds of policies. So that piece wasn't purely forensic, it was a little bit policy-ish at the same time. We had trouble getting it past the editors. We were talking about using nitrogen for agriculture in the Midwest and the effect of nitrogen runoff on the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, if you know what the hypoxic zone is. So these aren't absolutely pure distinctions, but they're clarifying. I'm being an academic, so I'm hedging. If you give me the next slide. Nope, sorry. Back to the forensic. Yeah, you were ahead of me. So forensic rhetoric. Most scientific documents, most of the time, fall into this category. In Greece, forensic rhetoric was what you did when you were talking in court. Forensic rhetoric tends to examine the past, and it's primarily concerned with establishing facts of any particular issue. Watch one of your court TV cases, that tends at least initially to be forensic. Because those facts are only as good as the evidence and the analysis that provides those facts, forensic rhetoric also spends a lot of time establishing the authority on which you speak, like the methodology in a scientific report is the authority for the results, which are the facts. In contemporary scientific discourse, forensic rhetoric appeals. The rhetorical notion of appeal can be a little vague, but if I say, look, I'm going to appeal to your sense of decency, don't do X, Y, and Z. So appeals is actually a common sense kind of notion. Forensic rhetoric appeals to our sense of rigor, to our sense of a standard methodology, to a sense of precision and scientific objectivity. Forensic rhetoric is almost always analytic. It breaks a problem down into parts, discrete parts, identifies them, and moves in a very stepwise fashion. Usually it has, in almost any piece of science writing, there are subsections with titles so that everything is broken into pieces. As an English professor, I never wrote that way until one of my friends, co-authors, who was a geologist, pointed out to me, and it was a great shock to me as a young scholar. He said, Carl, nobody's ever going to read your article from beginning to end. You got to break it up in pieces and give it subtitles so we can skim through it and get only the pieces we want. Just get the data. We don't want to hear all this other stuff you said. And it occurred to me, oh wow, that's a difference in how scientists write and read and how people in English write and read. And that's why scientific texts look different than the texts in my journals. You know, they skim them, they're just looking for a piece of data. You know, they're not trying to be enlightened. And I hope you didn't hear that as a left-hand jab at scientists. I'm going to get in trouble.
Just keep talking. Just keep talking.
Yes. So forensic rhetoric tends usually to have a very spare style. It never elaborates unnecessarily. That's something that came out of the 17th century in England, and plain style, and the notion that rhetoric was ornamentation and a waste of time. And forensic rhetoric tends to avoid ornamentation, anything that's not absolutely necessary. It often uses an omniscient, kind of detached, disembodied voice, you know, an anonymous expert. It rarely ever involves individual people or talks about individuals, except when it provides a literature citation to another article. Forensic rhetoric is always very qualified, very hedged. It will tell you what conditions apply to this, what the exceptions are, what the weaknesses in a claim are, and it can be very informative, but it's not often entertaining or light reading. You have to be motivated really to work your way through forensic rhetoric.
Did you say also very objective?
I said it uses a very objective voice, tone, and style. So the passive voice in most scientific writing is an attempt to reflect a notion of objectivity so that the subject, the speaking scientist, is absent from his or her text, the notion being that the individual scientist has, and his or her individuality has nothing to do with the knowledge. That's, I think, problematic and debatable, but that is the convention of most forensic and scientific style. So epidictic style, by contrast, was what the Greeks did on celebratory occasions. It was an occasional rhetoric. If you wanted to celebrate and praise somebody or condemn or blame someone, epidictic usually is a rhetoric where you're not looking at the past, you're looking at today, you're looking at the present. So the most famous piece of epidictic rhetoric, well, one of them in American history, is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Because Lincoln was commemorating the heroism of the soldiers who died at Gettysburg to defend the Union. But Lincoln's address also demonstrates something that's really important for us, especially about epidictic rhetoric, is that epidictic rhetoric has a function or a consequence of establishing shared values and building a community. A lot of the recent research on the Gettysburg Address says what Lincoln was really trying to do is get people to see and accept the value of a union and recognize themselves as members of a union. And in making that address, he was trying to change the way they thought about themselves and the union. And that's what epidictic rhetoric does. So oddly enough, I think jokes are a form, I get to tell you a joke. Jokes are a form of epidictic rhetoric because a joke is only funny with people who share the same values. So telling a joke is a kind of ritual performance of bonding, of building community. If I tell you, if you and I get together and we're drinking a beer and we start telling jokes, we're basically figuring out that we share something in common and we're building a sense of community together. And that happens implicitly through epidictic rhetoric. And for those of us who do work in sustainability, that's, I said we're not just giving information, we're trying to build values, shift values, build a sense of community. So I get to tell you a joke. I had to ask Kegel which of my jokes I could tell today. So I'm going to tell you my dean's joke, since I used to be a dean. You can only tell jokes in class if you're making fun of yourself. So the guy walks into the cannibal delicatessen and he looks up at the menu and it says, English professor brains, $1 a pound. Particle astrophysics professor brains, $2 a pound. Dean's brains, $25 a pound. And he's a little taken aback by this. English professor is $1? Particle astrophysics is $2. A dean is $25 a pound? What gives? The guy looks at him and says, do you know how hard it is to clean a dean's brain? I try. My other joke was kind of off color, so Kegel told me I couldn't tell it.
Only because we're filming.
Yes, right. We're filming. So accommodations of scientific texts for non-expert readers usually form epidictic rhetoric. Scientific texts are analytic, objective. Epidictic accommodations tend to be narratives. They tend to tell a story. They usually involve individual people that you can identify with and have sympathy for, or those individuals in the story become role models for you. It's either the researcher or someone, and we will see with the National Geographic piece, someone that they see in the scene, and this is just good science journalism. Readers of scientific documents they want to gather information, they want to look for that. Mike Burkhardt skims my piece, looks for the piece of data he needs to plug in to strengthen his own argument. When readers read accommodations, they're reading for general entertainment. They're not going to make an argument. They have a much less powerful purpose. It's much harder to keep them interested, much harder to keep them motivated to read. As a result, accommodations for non-expert audiences tend to appeal to somebody's sense of wonder or somebody's sense of mystery. Sometimes to what's the practical application of this dense scientific idea? What cool thing can I do to my lawnmower with this? Forensic rhetoric tends to ask the question, what are the facts and how do you know? What are the facts and what's your authority? What was your methodology? Epidictic rhetoric tends to answer simpler questions. Who cares? So what? What's the big deal? Why should I care? Those are the questions you need to think about as you're accommodating the forensic to epidictic rhetoric. Would you give me the next slide? All right, I want to...
Where's deliberative?
Yeah, where's deliberative?
Oh,
You have 3 points.
Where'd it go? There was a slide.
yeah.
Oh.
You're way up.
No, I
Keep
know, I
going
was
back.
looking. No, it's not there. You wanna,
Keep going.
there? We're missing it. We're
Slip
missing
one
a slide.
down. Stop there.
Okay.
Carl, regarding the epidemic rhetoric, when you said that regarding the reader's questions, like who cared and so what, that you're saying that the reader would be asking this to themselves,
Yeah, when you're
or that you should try to write in a way that people will have that reaction.
one of my friends years ago said there's 7 magic questions to writing, and one of them is, can you answer the question, so what, who cares? Those are, to keep people interested, to let them see the point of this, why it's important, why they should care, something to motivate them to keep reading. Epidictic rhetoric, especially the kind of accommodations we're talking about, you open up, National Geographic, and one of my friends who's an editor at National Geographic says, we can't write a story about anything that we can't point a camera at and take a picture, and we can't show you an individual person and make you sympathize with that person and make you personalize the story. I had pitched a story on soil and the dangers of soil in America to him, and he loved it, but he couldn't figure out, how we would take pictures of dirt and make them exciting. So there's a sense in which these aren't literally the questions people would have, but in a sense, the purpose of forensic rhetoric are, tell me the facts, right? This is Dragnet, only you and I have ever seen this show. The facts, ma'am, just the facts. None of that flourishy stuff. What are the facts, and how do you know those facts are accurate? Those are the core issues. With epidictic rhetoric, people are reading for entertainment, for enlightenment, for that's cool, out of curiosity. And if you look at accommodations of scientific rhetoric, they're almost always They tell you a story. As the National Geographic piece does, there are individual people in it that make you see, oh, I see why this is important. And look at this and we'll look at an example a little later. Look at what it does to this particular person who has a name, and you personalize it. I see why we should care about that. I see why this is important. So those questions are my own, I don't know if anybody else's, but my own sense of, those are the things in your head as a writer. You need to be thinking, have I answered those questions as I'm doing this piece? So somebody has a good sense of, why should I care? What's important? Why is this compelling? What difference does this make? Why should I keep reading? Does that make some sense?
Yes.
Okay. So to illustrate, why don't you back up one? Let me see if this works. Yeah, okay. To illustrate the difference here between forensic rhetoric, deliberative rhetoric, and epidemic rhetoric, I'm going to look at these two texts. I'm going to start with the e-waste, and I'm actually going to look at pieces of text and show you what I mean. And at the high-tech trash. This is a little bit of what we're going to do next time. So the article on e-waste is from Science of the Total Environment. It's forensic rhetoric. High-tech trash, National Geographic, is an epidemic accommodation. It's not literally this one particular piece translated, but it's the topic, the same information. There's not a footnote in this article to this article, but it's essentially the same topic. So in the technical article from Science of the Total Environment, it opens with an introduction that, now you can give me the next slide, that defines e-waste. It distinguishes it from WEEE, W-E-E-E, which I've learned is waste electrical and electronic equipment. It starts by making a distinction. We learned that e-waste describes electronic items like our computers, our cell phones, your televisions, whereas WEEE applies to consumer goods that have electronic components like my refrigerator or an air conditioner. And immediately after that introduction, starts with a distinction. The article addresses the question of the global production of e-waste. So it's answering the question, what are the facts? How much e-waste is there? So here are a couple of paragraphs as they are giving you two different calculations for the global stream of e-waste. Summing the available data indicates that the global production of e-waste was at least 13.9 million tons per year, this is British, in the middle of this decade. The figure doesn't include Latin America, Africa, Canada, or Russia, and doesn't account for the growth in the last 4 years. An independent estimation was obtained using equation 1. So there's some facts. Here's how we know. Here's the authority. Here's an equation using data from table 1. The data of the total number of computers, mobile telephones, fixed line telephones, televisions, radios. The total e-waste production, 11.7 million tons per year, is similar to the above calculation of e-waste produced in rich countries. Again, the total global e-waste production will be considerably higher because some of the data are 6 years old. Similarly, the mass of WEEE produced will be higher because it includes heavy electrical items such as refrigerators and air conditioning units. Adjusting the calculated figure of 1.3 million tons per year for a 20% growth of the world's GDP over the last 5 years gives us 16.8 million tons. Given that computers form the bulk of e-waste, that most e-waste is produced in rich countries, it's probable that the actual global e-waste production is 20 to 25 million tons per year at the lower end of the UN Environmental Program's estimation of 20 to 50 million tons per year. If you give me the next slide. I'm going to return to this in a minute. National Geographic takes up the same essay, but treats it very differently. So here's what National Geographic says. Computers are hardly the only electronic hardware hounded by obsolescence. A switch over to digital high-definition television broadcasts is scheduled to be completed in 2009, rendering inoperable TVs that function perfectly today, but receive only an analog signal. As viewers prepare for the switch, about 25 million TVs are taken out of service yearly. In fashion-conscious mobile market, 98 million US cell phones took their last call in 2005. All told, the EPA estimates that the US that year between 1.5 and 1.9 million tons of computers, TVs, VCRs, cell phones, and other equipment were discarded. If all the sources of electronic waste are tallied, it could total 50 million tons a year worldwide, according to the UN Environmental Program. Give me the next slide, please. So the article on e-waste is from the Science Journal is very precise. It explains its calculations so that they're transparent to readers. It provides total amount of e-waste, but it qualifies all of its claims. This is forensic rhetoric. It tells the readers what data were left out of the calculation. Oops, we don't have Latin America, Africa, Canada, or Russia. It identifies sources of inaccuracy. The data are 6 years old. It describes how the final figure was reached by multiplying the figure 13.9 million tons per year by a 20% GDP growth rate. That is, here are our assumptions. Here's how we work out the algorithm. It qualifies its final estimate by saying it is probable that the figure is 20 to 25 million tons a year. The e-waste article provides citations for every piece of its data. When I've been writing with scientists, we don't say anything in print that we can't give you a citation to a refereed journal. Nothing that doesn't have a citation to a journal that's refereed and has a high, what's the bibliometric? A high impact factor gets used. So the accuracy and the authority of the claim are the primary concern in an article, and it appeals to a scientific reader's sense of objectivity, of methodology, of absolute precision. My friends and I were publishing an article on a model for nitrogen leaching in soils in the Midwest into groundwater. And instead of saying the nitrogen leached through the soil into the groundwater, we had to say the nitrogen was available for leaching into the groundwater, because we'd done the calculations to figure out how much nitrogen there was that could leach, but we hadn't done the instrumented tests to see if that was how much was leached. So instead of saying leaches, we had to say is available. So science is always giving you incredible, and this is why it's so hard and it's so useful, incredibly carefully precise hedged conditionals. You don't get that in high-tech trash. If you give me the next slide. So in high-tech trash, this is Einstein, or this is, if you give them too much details, you lose their interest. When I was reading that to you, you were probably beginning to drift off. When I was reading the high-tech trash, it's a lot more engaging. Too many details, or do you mislead readers? So the essay in high-tech trash, by contrast, is concerned with telling us a nice engaging story, not with exact figures, not with a transparent methodology. The production of e-waste is framed in a context that's familiar to its readers. They talk about computers becoming obsolete, about analog TVs being displaced by digital sets, things that happened in all of our American households about 6 or 7 years ago, about fashion-conscious people buying new cell phones. Those are the everyday kinds of contexts that readers of National Geographic know, are concerned about, that are part of their life world, if you want to use that term.
Would it be wrong to say that the pediatric is a summary of forensic?
I don't think it would be wrong, in the sense that when I started, I said if you're accommodating something, you have to capture the core of the argument, but then you have to express it, reframe it in different styles. So it goes from objective and analytic to narrative and personal. It goes from analytic to very emotional. It goes from very precise and qualified to it's not inaccurate, but accuracy isn't the issue. So there's a sense in which you're summarizing, but you're doing more than just summarizing. An abstract for a scientific article published in a journal is a good summary, but it's not epidictic, and and I'm sure you have, you read a bunch of them, they're not very engaging, and people don't read them unless they're doing it for work, they're writing an article. Ma'am?
Would you say that this is kind of where bias is shown, or you're kind of trying to sell an idea? Like you can tell what the bias is of the writer?
Yes, to the extent that, I'm not sure I would use the word bias, but I pitched Epidictic as it's about building community and it's about shifting values.
Okay.
So if you look at I'll go out on a limb here. If you look at the National Geographic piece, it says let's see, there were televisions that function perfectly today. And then down here it says, fashion, in the fashion-conscious mobile market. I may be out on a little English professor limb here, but I think that's sort of like my telling you a joke. I tell you a joke making fun of deans because, you know, we're not deans, they're administrators, it's us against them. I think this has a cultural value that says, oh yeah, fashion-conscious people. It's a backhanded slap at people who care more about fashion and this year's cell phone than sustainability, than resource recovery, than e-waste. When I say epidemic rhetoric is about praise and blame, Gettysburg Address, for example, the essay on e-waste is, of course, if it becomes, in a sense, what most scientists are terrified of. It becomes activist. It doesn't claim neutrality or objectivity. It clearly has a set of values, and one of its goals is to tell you a story, but also to change the way you think, to think, oh, wait a minute, I need to figure out, and when I'm done, we'll look at something much more entertaining, which is Annie Lennox's The Story of Stuff. And it's biased in the sense not of objectivity or information or data, but it's positioned in the sense that it's trying not just to persuade you about e-waste, but to motivate you to share a set of values. It's like, you know, jokes.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. The other thing about the high-tech trash piece here, if you look at it in blue, it's full of action. The scientific text is just data. Nobody's doing anything. But most epidemic accommodations are full of action. So computers are hounded by obsolescence. Viewers are prepared for a switch. Cell phones take their last call. Equipment is discarded. The numbers involved are really remarkable. 25 million TVs are taken out of service, 98 million cell phones. And their final number, 50 million tons a year, it's not inaccurate, but it's the very top end of the EPA's or the European Environmental Protection's scale. The scientific piece said, we think it's probably more like 20 to 25 at the low end of the scale, but they say probably and they hedge it. These guys, it's not inaccurate, but they're making their strongest case. And they don't hedge it, they just say 50 million a year. It's not inaccurate, but it's biased in the sense of they're trying to make a powerful statement by giving you the far end of the probable scale. Ma'am?
Well, they're not saying it. They're saying it could be. So they're still trying to hedge it.
Yeah, but they don't say, you know, it's likely to be 20 to 25. So they're working on accuracy. They're not trying to be inaccurate. They're not misleading you, but they're trying to tell you an exciting story with that's a lot of stuff. Yeah, but it's not as hedged as the scientific text was. So the difference between these, you've got the precise analysis of the scientific article and an exciting story in National Geographic, and it runs throughout these two texts. A nice comparison here is the way they talk about recycling. The technical piece from Science of the Total Environment, recycling is a technical problem. The writer's concerned about a systems perspective, something like what Senshaw does in his systems analysis course. They account for everything involved, including the fuel burnt in transporting things, and it makes the text long, complicated, thorough, but not an exciting read. Give me the next slide. We should be on 15 now. So here's the text. E-waste recycling involves the disassembly and deconstruction of equipment or destruction of equipment to recover materials. Recycling can recover 95% of the useful materials from a computer and 45% of the materials from cathode ray tubes, monitors. In rich countries like Japan, high-tech recycling operations function well with little environmental impact. Any ecological benefits of recycling are more than offset if the waste has been transported over long distances to negative environmental effects of fossil fuel consumption. They're doing what's called energy balance, if you've done those calculations. You know, do you get more energy out than you put in? And if you have to transport it, you know, you've lost your benefit. However, recycling always has a lower ecological impact than landfill or incinerated e-waste. So by contrast, the next one, this is the same topic. And I'm just comparing and trying to get you to notice it's more than words that change. Even if this obsolete equipment remains in attics and basements indefinitely, never reaching a landfill. This solution has its own indirect impact on the environment. In addition to toxics, e-waste contains goodly amounts of silver and gold and other valuable minerals that are highly efficient conductors of electricity. In theory, recycling gold from old computer motherboards is far more efficient and less environmentally destructive than ripping it from the earth, often by surface mining that imperils pristine rainforests. I'm trying to read suggestively. So in this accommodated version, we get, again, a familiar scene. It's old equipment up in your attic. You can go in particular places in my house and find lots of electronics that we don't know what to do with, but we can't use. Everybody has this, almost everybody has this in their house. Instead of useful materials in the science, we hear about silver and gold. Recycling is compared to active verbs, ripping it from the earth and imperiling not an ecosystem, but a pristine rainforest. And I happen to like pristine rainforests. The issue here is not that National Geographic version is untrue or inaccurate. It's not. But the choice of details creates an emotional appeal to the wonders of hidden silver and gold, to the violent images of destroying, ripping the earth. Finally, there's one more difference between the objective analysis of e-waste in the science article and the emotional appeal in National Geographic. And it's clearest in the sections where the text talks about the process through which we recycle e-waste. So if you give me the next slide. In the scientific text, it doesn't talk about the human cost. What you get is this process can be automated or carried out by hand. In poor countries, there's little risk. There is risk that children may be employed to separate e-waste components. An open flame is often used to free components, which may result in exposure to volatilized contaminants. Okay, the National Geographic piece. By contrast, the writer talks about, he walks into an e-waste recycling area and describes what he sees. Choking, I pull my shirt over my nose and approach a boy about 15, his thin frame wreathed in smoke. Karim says he's been tending such fires for 2 years. He pokes at one meditatively, then then his top half disappears as he bends into the billowing soot. He hoists a tangle of copper wire off the old tire he's using for fuel and douses the hissing mass in a puddle. With the flame retardant insulation burned away, a process that has released a bouquet of carcinogens and other toxins, the wire may fetch $1 from a scrap metal buyer. So the language here in the accommodation is really picturesque. His thin frame wreathed in smoke. He pokes a fire meditatively. He douses a hissing mass in the puddle. It's a story, it's personal. We know Karim's name, we know his age, we know what he does for a living. And the passage ends with a really bitter irony. He's being poisoned by a bouquet of carcinogens from scrap that's going to fetch $1. So the only thing left out of this paragraph, next slide, is what's the cost of a human life? And I picked this photograph from one of my colleagues in Canada, who's a professor of photography, takes his students to Africa every year and photographs e-waste recycling dumps. And he kindly gave me this picture. This is an accommodation that tells us pretty clearly what are our values, what's good, what's bad, and motivates us to think and care. Does more than persuade us, here are some facts. So the accommodation of scientific discourse into this popular epideictic is probably the most common form of accommodation you guys are going to run into. But it's not the only type. So I'm going to talk quickly here about deliberative rhetoric. Okay. Deliberative rhetoric is what happens when people deliberate, when they discuss, when they debate. What's the best course of action? That is, given some situation, some set of facts, what should we do? This is the question you're asking. Deliberative rhetoric is what goes on in legislative bodies, in regulatory bodies. People debate or discuss what we should do in the future to promote our common good or to protect ourselves from harm. It appeals to a reader's or a listener's practical wisdom. Is this going to work? What's practical? To their shared value for efficiency. Let's do things that are efficient, that will work, and to our sense of self-preservation. You know, will it work? Is it efficient? And will it keep me safe? Even a cursory glance at most of our politics and legislative debates show you that this is everywhere, that it's highly charged. There's a great deal of disagreement over this, and that deliberative rhetoric is anything but calm, objective, like forensic rhetoric. It's not what are the facts, but okay, given the facts, given our values, what should we do in the future? I'm going to suggest that deliberative rhetoric is what is really important to sustainability, because one of the definitions of sustainability is how do we act today to provide, a usable world in the future for future generations that doesn't restrict their opportunities and increase their challenges. So deliberative rhetoric is really, in a sense, the active core of sustainability. How do we persuade people of what we ought to do? So the third document I want to look at so deliberative rhetoric also, it appeals, to practicality. Its style tends to be, it will give, and we will talk about argumentation in a week or so. Deliberative rhetoric tends to say, here's a claim, this is what we ought to do, and I will give you an argument. I will give you evidence to support that claim. It tends to be, at its best, rather prudent. It tends to be rather reserved. It tends to be comparative, except in the Florida legislature, it tends to be relatively reserved and rational. Oops. So the third document I want to look at, if you give me the next slide, and we're going to talk about these, but I'm trying to give you a frame of reference for reading them for next class. So in the policy statement 572 on recycling electronic waste from the American Society of Civil Engineers is a piece of deliberative rhetoric. It takes up a technical problem on e-waste, it presents a very bare set of facts, and then it reframes this technical problem, not as a technical problem of how do you know and what are the facts, but in the context relevant for policymakers. What are the policymakers concerned about? What are their values? What decisions do they need to make? So just like high-tech trash, this one reframes a technical problem, not as a story, not as a human story with concrete details over consumers' lives. It's an accommodation for legislators. So they start by defining the problem. Starts with a very simple, direct example. The American Society of Civil Engineers supports federal and state policies that comprehensively promote effective and efficient collection of proper recycling of waste electronics in well-engineered facilities on a national basis. A claim, legislation should be consistent with the principles of product stewardship and should target all electronic wastes for recycling and reuse in an environmentally safe and economic manner. And a bit later it defines, if you'll give me the next slide, it defines the problem It defines the problem here as 82% of e-waste is discarded, but it does it in its legal regulatory form. That is, the state-to-state approach down here could result in 50 different legislative mandates. This is not about facts or authority, it's about what are the practical problems, how do we implement it as a policy, why do you need a national as opposed to a state-by-state policy? These are the things that regulators and policymakers care about. Down at the end, it makes an appeal down here at the bottom. It says a state-by-state approach is expensive to industry and consumers alike. The policy statement appeals to our sense of self-preservation. Nobody wants to spend more money than you need to on recycling. And finally, it closes, it closes by making an argument that it's practical. They're already doing it in Europe and Asia. It can be done. Other people have already done it, and it's efficiency. Product stewardship will help conserve energy and resources and minimize pollution. So it's appealing to all of those values for regulators. It's practical, it's efficient, it's self-preservation. I'm all but done. The language of this policy statement is very professional, it's very reserved. Unlike the epideictic accommodation, there are no individuals, there are no vivid images, there are no emotional appeals, it's not epideictic. The values involved are very different. They're regulatory, political values of practicality, efficiency, and self-preservation. It speaks with the calm authority of the American Society of Civil Engineers. The forensic rhetoric piece on e-waste provides copious details to support its claims, the facts about the case. This statement doesn't. It basically depends on the cultural authority of this great big group of civil engineers. So it doesn't have to prove everything. It just says, look, the American Society of Civil Engineers have looked at this, have debated it, we're experts, take our word for it, we're speaking ex cathedra as a professional organization. And the policymakers, I don't know if you've run into them, no policymaker is going to read more than a page if they're going to read a whole page. You have to give it to them in about a paragraph and a half. Because they're doing, not because they're lazy or dumb, they have too many things to do, and they probably can't read and don't care about the details. They're perfectly happy to go to their experts, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and say, you guys are the experts, you just, tell us, give us the summary, give us the short, fast, and dirty version of it. We don't need the hedging details, the calculations, that's your business. Anyway, what I've done for you is suggest that there are a lot of things that shift between the technical piece and the epideictic and the deliberative rhetoric, and they shift because different audiences are reading with different purposes. They're going to do different things. They have different knowledge base. So it's not just technical terms, shift. It's not just words. It's not just sentence length, although you'll find that sentence length will also change. But these are the kinds of things that we want you to look at as you read these three things. They're loaded up on your text. That's your assignment for next week. And one of the things we will do, spend time doing, instead of me walking you through doing a little analysis, we're just going to write on the board and ask you, what did you see that changed? What's different? How does this one work, this one work, this one work? The best way to learn how to do this is watch how somebody else did it. I'm hoping that the notions of epideictic, forensic, and deliberative, the notion that epideictic is about the present, forensic is about the past, deliberative is about the future, that you make different kinds of appeals, gives you a kind of skeleton apparatus for seeing, well, how do you do that? It's not just you change some words. You really have to, it's not just a summary, but you're reframing the summary in very specific kinds of ways. Okay. And that's what we're going to, with that as your kind of lead in, that's what we're going to do next time. Do we have time to look at Annie Lennox?
We do have time.
Or Annie Leonard. Annie Lennox, right, rock
Yeah,
and roll
not
singer.
Annie Lennox. Yeah.
You all know Annie Lennox from the Eurythmics?
Maybe
Yeah, you know Annie Lennox.
Um,
We're going to show you, because you've been very patient listening to me lecture, we're going to show you a really cool accommodation of e-waste.
yeah.
Do you know Annie Leonard's The Story of Stuff?
Some people do, yeah.
Yeah.
It never hurts to watch it again. So again, everything that you need, all your links are under the pages. So for next week, you'll be reading the e-waste science of the total environment. So that's the scientific article Carl was just talking about, and then the National Geographic piece, which some of you may have read before. It made the rounds a few years ago. It's really good. And then finally the policy statement. If you want to go ahead, and I saw a few people with printouts, right? At the bottom of the page is where everything, all the supplemental stuff is, right? So I've already posted the PowerPoint and lecture notes from tonight. We have some discussion questions to sort of get you thinking about how the Annie Leonard piece works. And then if you want to go ahead and we're going to look at it in detail next week, the project one.